Cassian Wilder first noticed the anomaly 4 weeks after the wedding, on a rain-shuttered Monday when quarterly forecasts had driven every sane executive from the office and left him alone with stacks of glossy proofs from the society photographer. He flipped through the images expecting to critique nothing more consequential than bouquet placement. But somewhere between the second toast and the sparkler exit, his pulse stalled. Meridian's figure radiated effortless grace in every frame. The sweep of her champagne silk gown, the tilt of shoulders that hinted at ballet training, the sure way her palm anchored against his lapel. But where her face should have been, the glossy surface rippled with a smear of soft distortion, as if someone had wiped Vaseline across the lens only at the exact coordinates of her features. No eyes, no smile, no hint of cheekbone. Just a swirl of muted color that mocked the high-resolution sensor. At first, Cassian assumed a printing defect. He called the photographer, a Paris-trained virtuoso whose resume included royal anniversaries, and demanded a fresh set. The replacement shipment arrived overnight, triple-boxed and humidity-sealed. Same nightmare. Meridian's face rendered into painterly blur, though backgrounds and guests remained tack-sharp. Cassian turned to the digital files stored on a titanium flash drive. Every JPEG, every RAW, every 8K slow-motion clip captured by the drone hovering above the reception lawn displayed identical corruption isolated on her visage. Metadata showed no tampering. Pixel-level histograms revealed perfect continuity elsewhere. He shut down his office lights, let Manhattan's storm-tossed skyline paint fractured reflections on the floor-to-ceiling glass, and scrolled through images of a bride who somehow existed and didn't. Anxiety tasted metallic, dredging up childhood memories of waking to find his mother's portrait ripped from frames by a father desperate to erase reminders. He told himself Meridian was real. He could still feel the phantom silk of her veil between his fingers. But rational proof stuttered. Security footage from the penthouse corridor offered no solace. The night after the wedding, Meridian had waved at the camera on her way to the elevator. Yet playback now showed only a faceless silhouette in a shimmering gown walking down polished marble. Cassian leaned back from the monitor, throat tight. He reopened the archived Zoom recording of their first board-approved appearance as husband and wife. The boardroom video had once shown Meridian presenting her genomic stability research with incisive clarity. Today, her face dissolved into fuzz while her voice remained crystalline. Cassian tasked 3 separate IT divisions to run diagnostics. The Shanghai satellite office reported clean checksums, yet confirmed what New York saw: corrupted facial data isolated to Meridian. Meanwhile, the luxury gossip blogosphere erupted with rumors. A paparazzo published candid shots from a gala roof deck, Cassian in black tie, Meridian in moonlit silver, and commenters speculated she wore sheer veils to cultivate mystique. The truth was simpler and infinitely stranger. The veil didn't conceal her. Reality itself had wrapped her in encryption. He confronted Meridian that evening in the penthouse atrium, glass palms rustling under climate-controlled breeze. She listened without interruption, hands clasped around a mug of peppermint tea, the steam smudging momentary halos around her eyelashes. When he finished, she exhaled a measured sigh and said she'd hoped to postpone this conversation until their honeymoon in Amalfi. But secrets, like fissures, widened under pressure. She reached for the tablet, displaying her blurred visage, and touched the screen. Where her fingertip grazed, pixels sharpened for a heartbeat, revealing a dark eye rimmed with gold flecks before blurring again. Cassian recoiled, half expecting smoke. Meridian led him to the private study whose bookshelves housed first editions and NDA-sealed prototypes. She unlocked a drawer and withdrew a slim titanium case, engraved with a sigil Cassian didn't recognize. A stylized serpent devouring its tail. Inside lay a polycarbonate ID badge from the U.S. Marshals Service, Witness Security Division, bearing a name he'd never heard, Serafina Locke, and a photograph of Meridian smiling, her face perfectly intact. The issue date read 17 months prior to their first encounter at the biotech conference in Zurich. She explained that 6 years ago, while head of pharmacovigilance at Valente Pharma, she had uncovered a clandestine program funneling opioid precursors to cartel labs. When she threatened disclosure, the Valente family staged her disappearance in a laboratory explosion. The marshals extracted her minutes before the blast, reshaping her life through facial rendering obfuscation tech, a neural net filter seeded into every mainstream camera firmware by a quiet federal mandate. To strangers, to CCTV, to any digital device within jurisdiction, her features would scramble into anonymity. Only analog memory remained, vulnerable in human mind, but invisible to code. Cassian absorbed her confession like glass absorbs impact, spiderweb cracks forming beneath composed surface. He asked why she had risked stepping into the spotlight of his company's gala circuit, where thousands of lenses hunted for new intrigue. Meridian's shoulders squared. She confessed she believed Wilder Biosolutions' global clout could protect her better than isolation. She hadn't foreseen that Valente's influence reached into firmware updates abroad, that the mob would track anomalies in optical data streams until they triangulated her signal. Recent chatter on dark web boards indicated the family had narrowed her to 3 North Atlantic metro areas. Cassian's wedding had handed them a timetable. Sirens wailed somewhere along Fifth Avenue. Cassian felt the skyscraper sway. He asked Meridian the question already burning. "Did you marry me for sanctuary?" She met his gaze, unblurred to him in candlelight, and said she married him because during their first Zurich coffee he noticed she always stirred clockwise and asked whether it was deliberate. Someone aware of patterns, willing to question them. She believed such a man could love a woman who lived behind algorithms. Outside, lightning forked over the Hudson, illuminating a convoy of black SUVs queuing at the building's security gate. Cassian's phone pinged, a silent alert from lobby surveillance. Employees, marked with Valente facial metrics requesting penthouse access under guise of corporate compliance audit. He closed the titanium case with a click that felt like loading a pistol. Meridian asked what he intended. He said facelessness was no longer sufficient armor. They would rewrite the lens itself. He dialed Bishop Wilder, the firm's chief information officer, ordering total network lockdown and biometric reassignment to level black. Sprinklers concealed within the vertical garden hissed, releasing nanoparticle mist that jammed infrared trackers. Meridian pocketed the ID badge, the serpent sigil flashing under chandelier light, and followed Cassian toward the private elevator leading to their rooftop helipad. As doors slid shut behind them, she reached for his hand. Her skin felt ice-cool, yet the grip anchored him. He wondered whether love could flourish without visible proof. Photographs, videos, shared selfies. But the weight of her fingers argued that presence trumped evidence. Below, the elevator shaft thrummed as unauthorized override attempts pulsed up the tower. Cassian whispered that he had 30 minutes before Valente breached physical security. Meridian whispered back that 30 minutes was ample to hack a legend if one knew which mythos to borrow. Elevator cables shuddered. Cassian drew Meridian closer, the scent of peppermint still ghosting her hair. The secretive life he'd built on measurable outcomes had fractured the moment pixels refused to obey laws of optics. Now, abandoning certainty, he bent to kiss the blurred space where her lips should be, and in that nearness found the outline his eyes couldn't hold, felt the contours memory would catalog even if no device ever could. The elevator doors opened to storm-lashed rooftop, and together they stepped into sheets of rain, two silhouettes poised to outmaneuver a family whose weapon was visibility, armed only with a love impossible to photograph but impossible to erase. Rain whipped across the rooftop in diagonal sheets, flattening Meridian's silk skirt against her legs and turning Cassian's charcoal suit the color of wet slate. Yet neither of them flinched as the helicopter's landing lights ignited in pulsing amber. The rotors were still tied down. Wilder Biosolutions security pilots refused to keep turbines idling on idle nights. So Cassian sprinted toward the chopper's nose, boots splashing through rainwater already pooling on the helipad, and yanked the tie-downs loose while Meridian pried open the cockpit hatch. Wind howled between skyscrapers, dragging ribbons of cloud low enough to scrape the tower's antenna, and lightning burst somewhere over Jersey, strobing the river into liquid mercury. Cassian clambered into the pilot seat, toggled fuel pumps, and thumbed the starter. Turbine whine rose, faltered, then caught. Blades lazily chopping rain into spirals that slapped back against the plexiglass like fists. Meridian climbed in beside him, eyes darting to the tower's stairwell door, still closed for now, and strapped herself into the co-pilot harness, fingers dancing across avionics with muscle memory that surprised him until he remembered the marshals. Service-trained evac assets in everything from small arms to emergency VTOL procedures. As rotor RPM climbed, Cassian radioed Wilder Tower's security deck. Bishop answered, voice a metronome of calm despite muted alarms shrieking in the background. The Valente crew had reached the executive lobby with forged badges, triggered biometric failsafes, and now jammed elevator shafts with portable signal dampers. Wilder's internal lockdown held, but breach predictions narrowed to minutes. Cassian ordered him to remote scramble every server cluster containing experimental drug dossiers, Valente's likely prize, and reroute off-site backups to an Icelandic cold storage vault under alias protocols. Bishop warned that severing fiber trunks would cripple global vaccine distribution logistics for weeks, but Cassian's reply cut him off. Do it. We're evacuating. He saw Meridian's shoulders relax. A tension he hadn't known burdened her until it eased. She adjusted the transponder frequency to a medical mercy code that forced local air traffic towers to grant corridor priority, even in storm cells. The collective thump of feet against metal rose from the stairwell. The rooftop door shook as override pins ground at its lock. Cassian lifted the collective slightly. Skids quivered, still lashed by the last tie-down. Meridian popped her harness, slid out beneath the still sluggish rotor arc, and slashed the remaining cord with a spring-loaded rescue knife before sprinting back just as the rooftop door burst inward. 3 men in soaked suits emerged, night vision goggles glinting green under strobe lights. They raised suppressed machine pistols, muzzles spitting ember flares against the gale. Meridian dove through the side hatch. Cassian yanked the collective full. Skids floated, and the chopper lurched up, bullets pinging fuselage. Wind shear jerked them sideways, Cassian corrected with cyclic input honed from weekend humanitarian hops in Haiti. Nothing like this storm, but muscle memory helped. The helicopter cleared the parapet by meters, rotors chewing cloud fragments as high-caliber rounds stitched the air they'd occupied. Meridian buckled in, knuckles white, but face composed, the only blur her features made in real time, an ironic anonymity that thwarted targeting algorithms even now. They punched through the lowest cloud deck, city vanishing beneath churning pewter. Meridian synced an encrypted SATCOM channel, patching Cassian's headset into a Marshall net dormant since her extraction. A voice responded. Deputy Director Reyes, surprised but brisk, promising to vector a covert escort from McGuire Air Base if they could reach coastal airspace. Cassian plotted a course south along the Hudson, skirting restricted zones. Below, lightning webbed across industrial rooftops, and sirens dopplered through breaks in thunder. Meridian's hand found his forearm, cool and steady, grounding him more than the artificial horizon ever could. 5 minutes into the flight, a tone warbled. Radar lock. A Valenti drone, likely deployed from a speedboat on the Hudson, climbed behind them, its forward cannon capable of shredding light aircraft. Meridian toggled IR countermeasures, but the helicopter's civilian package lacked full flares. Cassian shoved the collective, nosed down toward the river gap between two residential towers, rotor arc flirting with antenna arrays. Rain hammered windscreen. Wipers slapped futilely. G-forces pinned them as he banked hard left, tracing the serpentine pathway of Riverside Drive 500 feet below. Buildings blurred into canyon walls. The drone followed, its smaller mass handling tighter turns. Meridian keyed open a floor panel, revealing an emergency gear locker, and extracted a compact EMP carbine. Another Marshall contingency. But the open door necessary to fire would shear them sideways in this wind. Cassian spotted the neon sprawl of the Intrepid Sea Airspace Museum ahead, its decommissioned submarine moored like a leviathan. Inspiration flickered. He dropped altitude, rotor tips nearly clipping rooftop HVAC units. Meridian realized his intent and braced. At 30 feet above the Hudson, he leveled, then plunged beneath the overhang of Pier 86, momentarily hiding rotor signature. Water spray geysered. The drone miscalculated clearance, attempted to follow, and clipped a steel girder with lethal crunch, spiraling into the river in a plume of sparks. Cassian hauled collective. Helicopter vaulted back into storm-shredded sky, skids dripping river water. He inhaled shakily, adrenaline buzzing like live wire. They breached the cloud layer over Staten Island, where weather softened into mere drizzle. Meridian patched Reyes again. Marshall escort confirmed, but 15 minutes out. Cassian's fuel reserves dwindled, weight of evasive maneuvers, and he refused to risk Newark's congested radar. Meridian proposed a temporary set-down at a decommissioned Coast Guard station on Sandy Hook. Old helipads remained intact, and storm cover would obscure them until escort arrival. Cassian angled southwest, muscles trembling as the Manhattan skyline receded, a jagged shadow swallowed by rain. While terrain slid beneath, Meridian talked him through a deeper plan. The Valente family's reach extended into federal subcontractors. Witness security tech had been commandeered for corporate paranoia, explaining firmware sabotaged globally. To truly unmask herself, and thus strip Valente of leverage, she needed to reverse seed the same neural net filter with a purge key broadcast from Wilder Bio's private satellite Hemera. scheduled to pass overhead at dawn. Cassian would need to regain control of headquarters servers to inject the key. Bishop's shutdown ironically protected them from Valenti, but also from Cassian's access. Meridian outlined a cyberside door, using Wilder's old R&D server farm in Hoboken. Mothballed but reachable via line-of-sight laser link once the satellite rose above horizon. Cassian listened, impressed anew by the tactical brain hidden behind the blur. She wasn't just a damsel inside encryption, she was the architect of her own jailbreak. They touched down on Sandy Hook's cracked concrete just as fuel alarms bleeped. Rotor stilled into silence, broken only by gull cries and distant thunder. Cassian and Meridian huddled beneath rotor mast, rain now a mist, while she calibrated the EMP carbine for perimeter defense. He watched her silhouette against lighthouse beacon flickers and marveled at how familiarity grew from fragments. Her precise diagnostics, the peppermint scent still threading through storm-soaked air, the soft catch in her breath whenever she recalculated threat matrices. A pair of unmarked Blackhawks appeared low on the horizon, rotor noise whisked by wind. Reyes's voice crackled. Guardian escort inbound. Cassian exhaled, muscles unclenching incrementally. As the first Blackhawk settled, downwash flattening dune grass, Meridian turned to him. The blur softened. Maybe his eyes learned to extrapolate edges his cameras never could. She told him once the purge key propagated, every photo ever taken would reveal her face. Anonymity lost forever. Cartel hit lists would follow, but so would public scrutiny. Sunlight she'd avoided. She asked if he was prepared to love a woman now that the world could see her. Scars, past, and all. Cassian cupped the curve of her jaw, felt real skin, real warmth. The world has owned my face since I rang the opening bell, he said. It can survive knowing the woman who makes me whole. Marshals hustled them into the Black Hawk, medic checking vitals, Tex securing the EMP carbine. As they lifted north toward Hoboken, Cassian glimpsed Manhattan's blackout wedge, the Wilder Tower, power grid still isolated, and vowed those lights would burn again only when truth did. Meridian rested her head against his shoulder, blur melding into rain-streaked window reflection. And, for the first moment since corrupted wedding photos shattered complacency, Cassian felt the narrative pivot in their favor. The mob could manipulate optics, but it had underestimated the oldest variable: two people choosing each other in the dark and refusing to be edited out. Cold dawn spilled over the Hudson in bruised lilac bands as the twin Black Hawks skimmed low, toward Hoboken, their rotors cutting the river mist into scrolls that curled away and vanished before the first commuters stirred. Cassian watched the Wilder Tower recede, its windows dark, emergency beacons pulsing, while the decommissioned R&D campus emerged ahead. 5 stories of brutalist concrete half devoured by creeping ivy. The structure had once throbbed with gene-editing breakthroughs before zoning battles exiled heavy wet lab work to Long Island. Now it served as fallback bunker, its fiber trunks severed from the public grid. Its rooftop dish rust-coated, but still mechanically sound. Meridian squeezed his hand as the helicopter hovered over the cracked landing pad, rain gutters rattling in the downwash. Marshals in matte gray tack suits rappelled first, sweeping the perimeter with LiDAR rifles that painted ghostly red geometries across abandoned loading bays. Satisfied, they waved the passengers down, boots splashed in puddles glittering with oily dawn light. Inside, The lobby smelled of inert plastic and dusted halogen. Emergency LEDs flickered to life as a Marshall tech spliced a portable fusion cell into the dormant panel. Cassian's memories unfurled. Late-night debates over CRISPR off-targets echoing through these corridors. Meridian's research grant proposals once shipped here for biosafety review. An irony not lost on him now that they'd returned to resurrect a different kind of identity. They hurried past cubicle graveyards and into the old server atrium where steel racks towered like monoliths, their LEDs dark but intact. Meridian knelt before the master console, pulled a toolkit from her bag, and began removing side panels with surgical efficiency. As she worked, Cassian circled the chamber's rim, checking sight lines. Rain drummed metallic rhythms overhead, punctuated by gull cries. In the distance, sirens wailed, a city awakening to end-of-quarter jitters, not yet aware that a biotech dynasty was at war with a crime family over the right to a single woman's face. Deputy Director Reyes appeared in the doorway, headset jammed against wind-tousled hair. He reported that Valente operatives had penetrated Wilder Tower's 39th floor before being stalled by internal lockdown. No casualties yet, but the cartel's cyber division was brute-forcing Bishop's severed servers, hoping to locate Meridian's travel metadata. Cassian relayed instructions. Keep the tower in blackout until Hemera passed overhead. Any premature reconnection would broadcast their location. Reyes saluted with a wry grin. Order accepted. He stationed 2 marshals at the stairwells, then disappeared to coordinate aerial overwatch. Meridian slid the final panel aside, revealing twin motherboards sheathed in dust. She attached fiber couplers, soldered a bypass harness, and powered the cores. A low hum blossomed, LEDs flaring from red to steady cobalt. She glanced at Cassian, eyes bright behind the blur, and explained the next steps. Inject a purge key encoded in stochastic noise so camera firmware would accept her face as benign rather than blank. The key, essentially a biometric checksum, must propagate from Hemera's downlink to a constellation of content delivery networks. Within hours, billions of lenses would recalibrate. But first, she needed to compile a hash of her unfiltered visage. Cassian retrieved a vintage Hasselblad film camera from a storage crate, analog, immune to firmware sabotage, and coaxed 50-year-old gears to life. Meridian positioned herself against a blank wall, shrugged rain-heavy jacket from her shoulders, and let the overhead fluorescence gild her features. Cassian inhaled, marveling again that the blur dissolved in direct sight. She was all sharp planes and vulnerability. Freckles dusted across the bridge of a nose no algorithm had acknowledged. The shutter's click reverberated like a starter pistol. Meridian fed the exposed film into a portable chemical processor whose fumes mingled with ozone leaking from cracked HVAC vents. Minutes later, a fresh negative emerged, her face perfectly etched. She scanned it into the console. An amber progress bar crept across the monitor, while lines of cipher scrolled like incantations. Outside, the sky brightened. Hemera would crest horizon in 16 minutes. Cassian double-checked rooftop azimuth servos, swore at rust-frozen actuators, and hammered them free with a crowbar until the dish groaned into alignment. Rain began anew, light but insistent, plastering his hair to his forehead and tasting faintly metallic. Inside, Meridian reviewed the compiled purge packet. 64 terabytes of adaptive codec ready to ride Hemera's high-frequency beam. She plugged a thumb drive into the console's final port, but the system spat an error. checksum mismatch. Her shoulders stiffened. A subroutine, Valente sabotage or leftover Wilder exploit code, blocked any outbound transmission triggered from local admin accounts. Cassian cursed. Without time to cipher new credentials, they needed root access tied to Wilder's legacy biometric imprint. His late father, Dominic Wilder. Meridian's gaze flicked to the far end of the atrium, where a locked vault door bore Dominic's palm print sensor. Cassian's heartbeat stumbled. He hadn't stepped into that archive since the funeral when lawyers sealed it. Activation required both genetic and positional checks. Reyes's comm crackled. 5 minutes until Hemera's zenith. Valente drones sighted over Jersey City, vectoring their way. Cassian sprinted down the aisle, palms sweating despite the cold. The sensor's chrome pad reflected his drawn face. He pressed his hand. Red error. Dominic's genotype differed too far. Meridian arrived breathless, eyes scanning the interface. She produced a vial from her coat, a stem cell microsyringe the marshals had provided for emergencies, containing haplotype fragments engineered to mimic progenitor markers for 2 minutes before degradation. They had one chance. She swabbed Cassian's palm, injected subdermally. Pins and needles raced up his wrist. He slammed his hand to the reader. Green halo blossomed. The vault door hissed open, stale air rushing out. Inside, rows of decommissioned blade servers blinked alive as redundant power flowed. Meridian located an admin kiosk, inserted the thumb drive, bypassed the block. Hemera's uplink timer flashed. 90 seconds. Cassian stepped back to the doorway, scanning atrium windows where dim silhouettes flitted. Valente scouts rappelling onto lower balconies. He shouted to Reyes, who unleashed suppressive fire from rooftop. Bullets pinged off reinforced glass. Time tightened like a noose. Upload initialized. Meridian's eyes locked on cascading progress. 10%, 20. Outside, a drone smashed against window laminate, cracking spiderwebs but not penetrating. 30%. Reyes yelled that more hostiles breached ground level. Gunfire echoed corridors. Meridian whispered code to herself. 40. 50. Cassian gripped her shoulder. Vibration shimmered through the floor as a shape charge detonated at the main doors. 70%. He drew the EMP carbine, took a position behind server racks. A Valente gunman burst into the atrium. Night vision lenses reflecting blue server light. Cassian fired. Electromagnetic pulse bloomed, frying the man's headset and dropping him convulsing. 85%. The blast shorted overhead fixtures, plunging room into twilight pierced only by server LEDs and the upload bar's glow. 95. Meridian's lips moved, counting milliseconds. A second intruder hurled a flashbang. Pulled pin clinked across concrete. Cassian dove, covering Meridian's body. White light burst, deafening, but upload meter ticked to 100%. Hemera's downlink engaged. Purge key encrypted into photon stream and lanced skyward. Meridian slapped the console, severing link. Outside, clouds parted as if sliced, a narrow beam of sunrise kissing the rooftop dish. Silence descended, punctured by distant sirens and the ragged breath of people who'd outrun probability. Reyes stumbled in, bleeding from a graze but grinning. He announced Valente forces retreating, drones falling dumb now that EMP pulses scrambled command circuits. Meridian sagged into Cassian's arms, blur softening as tears cut human lines down her cheeks. He pressed his forehead to hers, tasting sweat and fear. An alert chimed on his phone. Wilder Tower security feeds restored. He opened the first frame, Meridian during their Zurich panel 3 years earlier, and for the first time her face stared back, eyes alight, smile unmistakable. Minutes later, their own live selfie confirmed it. Camera display showed Meridian's features crisp, every angle diamond sharp, no algorithmic smear. She laughed, delirious. Cassian kissed her, the shutter capturing proof their love could finally be archived by more than memory. Outside, morning unfurled gold light over the Hudson. In apartments and offices across the city, thousands of previously glitched photos corrected themselves in real time, revealing the face of the woman whose anonymity had been both armor and cage. But victory carried a new frontier of peril. Valente no longer needed firmware hacks, they had a target. Cassian closed the vault, resolved that Wilder Bio's legal artillery would drag the cartel into sunlight, while Meridian vowed to testify. Her visibility now as weapon rather than weakness. As they walked into dawn, surrounded by marshals, Cassian realized photographs were not merely records. They were vows made visible, and he would wield every captured pixel to shield the woman who had taught him that sometimes the bravest way to be seen is to choose when to reveal your face and when to trust someone who recognizes you, even in the blur. The news cycle detonated the moment. Meridian's face seeped back into the world. Millions of previously blurred wedding shots, gala candids, and security cam clips re-rendered over morning coffee. The algorithmic smear evaporating like breath off glass. Social feeds christened her the woman who appeared. Hashtags proliferating faster than financial sector rumors. And by noon, every major network had dispatched camera crews to Wilder Tower, eager for comment from the biotech titan whose bride had materialized out of digital myth. Cassian expected that burn. He did not expect the second wave. The medical ethics journals demanding to know why proprietary anti-surveillance firmware even existed, nor the civil rights lawyers filing class actions on behalf of wrongfully blurred. Immigrants along border checkpoints where the Valentes had covertly seeded the same code to hamper identification. In one sunrise, Meridian had shifted from invisible liability to public lightning rod, and the attention crackled hot enough to fuse glass. She met it head-on. 48 hours after the Purge broadcast, Meridian stood behind a lectern in Wilder Tower's atrium, haloed by the geometric, stained-glass ceiling Dominic Wilder once commissioned to mimic a DNA helix. Reporters jostled under the pattern of art and science while she recounted her years as Serafina Locke, how she falsified data at gunpoint to keep Valente Pharma's opioid pipeline obscured, how she smuggled lab notebooks to the marshals, and how the Hacienda Valentes responded with an explosion that flung 6 innocent researchers across a parking lot. She bore witness to the cartel's chokehold on firmware contractors, the ghost patents filed under shell companies, the bribes funneled into congressional health campaigns. Cassian watched from the wings, pulse steady only because her voice never trembled. When questions turned venomous, why hide so long? Why marry into another corporate empire? She answered with an engineer's precision. Opacity protects power structures. I chose love because intimacy, at its purest, is radical transparency. And I knew Wilder Bio would rather burn its profit margins than shade the truth. Murmurs rippled. Cameras flashed. Somewhere, a Valente consigliere smashed a glass. That same afternoon, U.S. Attorney Geeta Narayan convened a grand jury, subpoenaing Wilder bioservers along with every archived Valente email Meridian could recall. Bishop oversaw terabytes of data exports, ensuring chain of custody, while legal teams built a firewall thicker than Manhattan bedrock. Yet inside the fortress, a quieter battle stirred. Cassian's general counsel unearthed a non-compete clause Meridian had signed under her alias, effectively binding her intellectual property to Valente Pharma. If unbroken, the cartel could claim joint ownership of any drug patents she developed within 7 years, including Wilder's forthcoming gene therapy platform slated to be worth billions and to save untold lives. The clause was dubious in origin, but menacing in court, and Valente lawyers weaponized it within hours, filing suit in federal district to freeze Wilder's clinical trial schedule. Cassian convened war council in the tower's subterranean strategy bunker, a room lined with holographic projectors and bulletproof coffee pots. Present, Meridian, Bishop, Geeta Narayan on encrypted link, and Elspeth Ortiz, a cybersecurity savant who once reverse-engineered a Foreign Defense Ministry worm for sport. Elspeth's role, mine. Valente's internal archives for proof the non-compete was signed under duress. Narayan wanted criminal leverage. Cassian wanted civil nullification. As rain hammered storm shutters, Elspeth's fingers danced over a projected keyboard, teasing out packet fragments from ocean cables Valente still thought secure. Within hours, she located an offshore chat log, a Valente capo instructing HR to get the girl's mark on any sheet, blood optional, signature secondary. Redacted metadata showed date-time stamps matching Meridian's hospital sedation after the lab. Explosion. Narayan exhaled triumph. Coercion established, but warned they needed an unbroken chain of screenshots to sway a judge. While Elspeth stitched evidence, Cassian shifted to containment. He reactivated Wilder's dormant Praxis initiative, an internal surveillance mesh once designed to track lab equipment, but shelved over privacy concerns. PraxCam nodes the size of thumbtacks could blanket the tower, logging faces and packet traffic in real time. Meridian objected. Visibility demanded ethics, not panopticons. But Cassian argued Valente guns had already breached their lobby. They compromised. Praxis would operate on air-gapped drives, its footage dumped to external counsel at day's end. Meridian set conditions. Cassian agreed, and trust bent but did not break. 3 days later, Narayan's office obtained an emergency injunction halting Valente's lawsuit, citing Elspeth's coercion cache. Victory tasted brief. That night, a Praxis node pinged an anomaly. Elevator 42 descending at 2:03 a.m., despite lockdown. Feed showed a janitorial cart rolling in. No operator visible. The camera flickered. Feed blanked for 2 seconds. Then the cart exited -1 robotic floor scrubber. Meridian, insomniac in the R&D library, caught the alert first. Scrubber chassis were large enough to house 6 kilograms of C4. She triggered silent alarms and sprinted for security command. Cassian met her halfway, barefoot, sidearm drawn though he had never killed anything larger than a lab rat. Bishop isolated the rogue scrubber circling a server floor where Meridian's original lab notebooks were stored for grand jury review. Security drones intercepted. Thermal cameras showed no explosives, only an EMP coil bonded to cleaner motors. A Valente signature. Wipe data. collapse cases. Cassian ordered containment. Drones doused the scrubber with polymer foam that neutralized the charge. Forensics later found a note etched inside the battery bay. Visibility can be fatal. Meridian studied the note, jaw set, and whispered that Valente's next strike would target flesh, not servers. At dawn, Narayan requested Meridian's physical presence at the federal courthouse to swear deposition. Publicity guaranteed some safety. Assassination in front of CNN cameras risked backlash. Cassian insisted on escorting, his presence doubling as corporate solidarity. They traveled in an armored SUV flanked by martial outriders, city streets glinting under clearing skies. As they rolled past Battery Park, Meridian caught her reflection in the bullet-resistant window. Face crisp, eyes unblurred, and felt a pulse of vertigo. Existence had weight now, a gravitational pull she'd never felt in all the ghost years. Cassian's hand enveloped hers, thumb tracing the vein track under wrist. Simple, grounding. The courthouse steps teemed with reporters. Microphones thrust forward. Cassian's PR shield formed a wedge. Meridian paused, inhaled, and turned to the lenses. She spoke without script, voice steady. I used to believe anonymity was armor. Today, I understand it was only a pause before accountability. If the Valente organization thinks fear will erase my testimony, they haven't studied pharmacodynamics. Long-term exposure builds tolerance. Flashes strobed. Cassian barked a wry laugh he couldn't suppress. They entered marble halls where history etched itself one affidavit at a time. Inside the deposition suite, Meridian detailed chemical supply chains, offshore shell firms, and firmware bribes. Opposing counsel tried to rattle her. Why keep lab notebooks if she planned to vanish? Why marry a billionaire? Whether her memory could be trusted after trauma. She parried each with data, timestamps, third-party corroboration. Cassian watched pride eclipse his worry. When proceedings recessed for lunch, the U.S. attorney whispered that this single morning had delivered more actionable intel than 2 years of wiretaps. Yet danger crept elsewhere. Valente Patriarch Giorgio, cornered, authorized an extraction of last resort. Take Meridian alive before afternoon session. A 6-man team in faux EMS uniforms hijacked an ambulance 2 blocks from the courthouse. Praxis drones overhead, recently added to city security at Narayan's urging, flagged the license plate mismatch. Bishop pinged Cassian's phone mid-hallway. Cassian read the alert, pivoted. Marshals herded them into a service corridor that funneled to a subterranean loading dock. The decoy ambulance screeched curbside. Men leapt with doped air injection darts. Cassian shoved Meridian behind a pillar, returned fire with issued Glock, rounds sparking ambulance grill. Marshals dropped 2 attackers. The rest retreated, but left a parting shot. A canister rolling toward the dock, spewing caustic aerosol programmed to erase DNA markers. Meridian grabbed a fire hose, doused the plume, while Cassian and a marshal dragged casualties to safety. Sirens converged within minutes. Valente operatives vanished into midday traffic, leaving only acrid mist and a deeper resolve in everyone breathing it. That night, government servers pushed the first indictments. Stock markets twitched, then plummeted Valente Pharma 12%. Cassian convened Wilder's board via hologram, assuring them R&D timelines survived. A skeptical director asked if marrying a witness had endangered shareholder value. Cassian answered that value rooted in deception was liability, not asset, and promised to route future profits from Meridian's anti-addiction compound into restitution funds. The motion passed 12-1. Near midnight, after the building quieted, Cassian and Meridian stood on the terrace overlooking a city whose lights no longer threatened to blur her outline. Wind tangled her hair. He tucked a strand behind her ear, the gesture intimate yet mundane, and that normalcy felt revolutionary. She confessed exhaustion not from fear, but from constant hypervigilance. Cassian admitted he'd memorized her face in private long ago, but seeing it reflected in the world still jolted him like déjà vu. They spoke of Amalfi plans postponed, of naming rights for a foundation aiding whistleblowers, of children who might inherit a world a degree more accountable because their parents refused to stay invisible. Below, traffic hummed eternal. Somewhere, a Valenti fixer surely loaded another contingency into a burner laptop. But Meridian, once erased pixel by pixel, now existed in millions of files, each a beacon impossible to stuff back into shadows. Cassian realized that the mob's greatest miscalculation wasn't underestimating his cybersecurity or legal reach. It was failing to grasp how swiftly a faceless woman could rally humanity to the simple outrage that no one deserves to be edited out of, their own life. He slipped an arm around her waist, felt her lean into him. Proof measured not in megapixels or market caps, but in weight transferred between two bodies sharing gravity at last. A week after the failed courthouse ambush, the city's spring rain settled into a sullen drizzle that blurred the skyline into graphite smudges and painted reflective halos around every street lamp. Cassian woke before dawn, heart lurching at the phantom echo of sirens that weren't there, and padded barefoot through the penthouse until he found Meridian seated on the floor of the conservatory, cross-legged amid a scatter of archival folders. She had switched off every overhead light and let only the glow of her tablet illuminate the paper flurries around her, so for a moment she looked like the nucleus of a constellation. Face, finally visible, suspended in midnight ink. She was building a timeline, color-coded tabs for wire transfers, post-its tracked to shipment manifests, red strings of annotation mapping Valente's influence from Port of New Orleans to Rotterdam, to an opiate pill mill in Bratislava. Cassian crouched beside her, tracing the curved edge of one shipping invoice where pen strokes dented the paper. Meridian admitted she'd slept 2 hours, woken by a dread that evidence might slip through bureaucratic cracks if it wasn't visualized, mapped, spoken aloud. She spoke with a clipped determination, the kind of tone scientists used when they'd isolated a deadly pathogen and refused to look away. Cassian suggested a break, real breakfast, coffee instead of adrenaline. But Meridian shook her head. She needed to finish before the morning's closed-door strategy session with Narayan and the DEA's Eurasian Interdiction Task Force. Knowing she wouldn't relent, Cassian fetched espresso anyway, then sat with her while dawn leaked blue-gray across glass walls. They worked shoulder to shoulder, Meridian dictating shipping lot numbers while Cassian typed, his fast corporate shorthand translating her memory into a spreadsheet of smuggling arteries. When she finally exhaled, satisfied, day had climbed higher. Traffic thrummed along Fifth, and the conservatory smelled faintly of damp earth and citrus from the automated mist cycle. Their driver delivered them to the federal building under a shroud of umbrellas and plainclothes marshals. In a windowless briefing room thick with stale ventilation and harsher fluorescent light, Meridian projected her web on the wall. Ports, shell corporations, banker names, firmware contract briberies. Narayan nodded along, then introduced a newcomer, Adriana Valente, Giorgio's estranged niece and a forensic accountant who had flipped state's evidence. Adriana's slender wrists bore stress scars from nicotine patches peeled too fast. Her eyes, smoky with exhaustion, drifted across Meridian's chart and confirmed every rote. She provided bank key codes that unlocked 4 Cayman accounts supporting Valente's firmware tamper project. Every person in the room felt the pivot. Evidence now airtight. Cartel's corporate mask cracking. Victory, however, brought complicating dilemmas. Adriana's plea bargain required relocation and a new identity. Precisely the condition Meridian had fought against all those faceless years. Narayan asked Meridian to mentor Adriana on psychological survival inside witness protection. Meridian stiffened. Trauma braided memory tight, but she saw the necessity. She said yes, though her eyes flashed with the cost. Cassian later squeezed her hand in the corridor, acknowledging the sting of returning to the shadows in order to pull someone else out of them. Meanwhile, Wilder Bio's board demanded forward momentum on their flagship anti-addiction therapy, a CRISPR-based receptor modulator. Clinical trial regulators, spooked by Valente litigation, demanded additional proof no intellectual property had been stolen. Cassian volunteered Meridian to give a live demonstration, editing opioid receptors in iPSC-derived neurons in real time. Broadcast to the FDA's secure in-house lab. Meridian accepted, though she hadn't stepped inside a BSL-2 hood in months, fingers more used to keyboard scrawls than pipettes. She spent the next 48 hours in Wilder's glass-walled cell culture suite. Gown rustling, hairnet hiding loose strands, while Cassian watched through observation glass, marveling at the calm precision that reemerged the moment she held a pipette. She manipulated CRISPR plasmids like concert violin bows. Neurons glowed under calcium flux microscopy. Assay curves curved exactly where regulators needed proof. When the FDA team logged off with provisional approval, Cassian burst into the suite, ignoring sterile zone etiquette, and hugged her so fiercely they nearly shattered a rack of serological pipettes. But each bright step cast longer shadows. Praxis sensors continued to catch Valente scouts trying ransomware ploys, and someone mailed a wedding photo with Meridian's face burned away. A crude omen she found in their private elevator. Cassian hired Elspeth to harden every digital lock, yet they both sensed an analog strike brewing. Meridian's public visibility ensured a narrow window for such an attack. Valente would gamble on spectacle now. The catalyst arrived on a Friday evening gala at the Metropolitan Museum, where Wilder Bio's philanthropic wing unveiled Visions Unblurred, a fundraiser exhibition of photographs that had spontaneously corrected after Meridian's purge signal. Curators displayed before and after pairs. Meridian's faceless wedding image beside its newly restored twin. Refugee ID photos reclaimed. Surveillance stills once smeared, now showing elderly parents reunited at airports. The exhibit's moral gravity magnetized press and donors alike, and Cassian saw Meridian's shoulders straighten as she walked through a gallery where her former erasure had become art. Yet he also noticed a ripple of unease skitter along her spine. Crowds are field laboratories for predators. Halfway through the gala, Cassian's phone pinged with an emergency praxis alert. Facial recognition flagged a Valente courier disguised as event staff, carrying a violin case lined with magnesium thermite. Before Cassian could act, the house lights dimmed for the keynote speech. Meridian took stage, teleprompter ready. In that darkness, Cassian threaded between guests, eyes scanning, but marble columns cast labyrinthine shadows. As Meridian began thanking donors, the fake steward slipped through a side alcove, case angled. Cassian intercepted 3 meters behind him, grabbing the courier's shoulder. The man spun, blade flicking out. Cassian blocked with his forearm, pain flowering as steel scored flesh. The case dropped. Magnesium canisters clattered. Meridian's voice paused mid-sentence but did not scream. She recognized danger in the thud. Marshals surged from exits, pinning the courier, but not before he hissed that Valenti greetings were always two-part. Today, a warning, tomorrow, a funeral. Security ushered guests into side halls while bomb techs neutralized the thermite. Meridian rushed off stage into Cassian's arms, blood streaking his sleeve. EMTs treated the wound, deep but clean. She trembled, not at the knife but at the truth behind Valente's message. They would escalate until curtains closed on someone's life. Cassian whispered an idea he'd turned over since Adriana's defection. Meridian blinked, then nodded slowly. It was time to drag the patriarch into daylight by his own hubris. Operation Mirror Maze coalesced in less than a week. Narayan secured a sealed indictment. Reyes reactivated dormant wiretaps. Elspeth crafted a honeypot, an encrypted drop site advertising the sale of Wilder's CRISPR therapy patent keys, laced with a digital watermark pointing to an exclusive meet in Valenti's own Brooklyn Riverfront Club. Meridian would deliver the keys herself, wearing a body camera streaming to federal custody. Cassian balked at the risk. Meridian argued she could read Giorgio's biochemical tells better than any agent, and that her visibility now offered the best bulletproofing. They compromised by fitting her with a subdermal Kevlar weave under evening gown and placing Cassian in an unmarked van outside, audio patched into her ear. On the appointed night, Meridian entered the club's chandelier-lit vault room. Giorgio Valenti waited with 2 lieutenants and a bottle of Tuscan red older than Meridian. Cameras caught her confident stride, the gown's emerald silk making her every bit the CEO's bride, rather than the lab ghost Valenti once erased. Cassian whispered encouragement into the comm. She pressed fingertip to hidden mic in acknowledgement, then began the pitch, painting a fake narrative of bored rebellion forcing the sale of IP. Valenti poured wine, eyes flicking across her face, a face he thought he'd obliterated. He asked whether she ever missed anonymity. Meridian answered that she missed fearlessness, and visibility had restored it. As Valenti leaned to sign the doctored papers, Meridian asked her prepared question. "Do you remember the explosion that saved your quarterly profits?" Valenti's nostrils flared, a micro-expression the marshal's AI flagged as admission. His murmur, collateral necessity, transmitted live to Narayan's team. Marshals stormed the club. Valenti reached for a hidden pistol, but Meridian flipped the heavy wine bottle, catching his wrist, sending aged Sangiovese arcing. Cassian, hearing struggle, bolted from the van and arrived in time to see handcuffs ratcheting closed around the patriarch's wrists. The trial became the decade's spectacle. Meridian testified. Her photos splashed across global front pages without a trace of blur. Adriana corroborated. Jury deliberated 2 hours before delivering guilty verdicts on conspiracy, racketeering, attempted homicide. Sentencing hearings reserved a seat front row for Meridian. She attended in a tailored white suit, Cassian beside her, reminding the world that erasure's antidote is relentless presence. Months later, the foundation they envisioned opened its first whistleblower legal clinic, funded by settlement money pried from Valente assets. Meridian returned to lab work, splitting days between formulating her CRISPR therapy and mentoring scientists who feared retaliation. Cassian's wound healed into a thin scar he wore openly during earnings calls, a talisman that profits mean little unless tethered to moral cost. On their delayed Amalfi honeymoon, they left cameras at home. One afternoon they walked a lemon-scented cliff path where sunlight opened like a lens aperture, and Meridian, in linen sundress, turned to Cassian, full face warmed gold, no blur, no concealment. He lifted an analog Leica, joking that he'd promise not to sell the negatives. She laughed, deeper than he'd ever heard, laughter free of scanning perimeters, and said, "Take the shot. If tomorrow edits me out, we'll build another correction." The shutter snapped, and Cassian knew that picture would hang in future galleries titled Persistence of Vision. Proof that love can focus even when the world tries to pixelate the truth into nothing. 2 months after the Amalfi interlude, Cassian and Meridian returned to New York to find the city in its late summer mood. Air salted by Hudson humidity, skyscraper facades shimmering like circuit boards under feverish sun, and for the first time in a year the Wilder Tower lobby felt less like a siege gate and more like the front door of a life they had consciously chosen to inhabit. Yet, beneath the fresh coats of security paint and the courteous nods of employees who had survived the Valente ordeal, a subtler turbulence waited. Shareholder factions quietly fretting about court costs, regulatory partners second-guessing, timelines, and board members who had applauded Meridian's victory now worried her fame might overshadow the science they'd banked their careers upon. Cassian sensed the shift in the briskness of hello goodbyes, in the way venture analysts lingered on quarterly slides that mentioned legal reserves, and in the email subject lines peppered with phrases like brand recalibration and visibility fatigue. Meridian, ever more attuned to micro-expressions since testifying, read the room faster. She saw how some colleagues blinked too often when speaking to her, as though her face, once ghosted, now burned retinas with inconvenient brightness, and she responded by doubling down on lab work, pinning chromatography charts to glass walls where anyone could see progress was tangible, not just headline fodder. The immediate mission was Phase 2, trials of the CRISPR receptor modulator, a multi-center study spanning Johns Hopkins, Karolinska, and a rural Oklahoma clinic that served communities ravaged by synthetic opioids. Meridian insisted on visiting each site, refusing to be a distant figurehead. Hopkins welcomed them with polished presentations, but it was Oklahoma that rewired her perspective. A single-story brick building beside a dormant grain elevator, where patients arrived in pickup trucks, children in tow, hoping a genetic tweak could mute cravings that had dismantled their families. Cassian watched Meridian kneel in dusty parking lot light to explain double-blind protocols to a grandmother raising 3 toddlers because her daughter had overdosed. He saw the way the woman's weathered hand closed over Meridian's, and he understood, with a flutter of pride and humility, why profits had always been the least interesting part of this venture. Back in Manhattan, Wilder's regulatory affairs chief, Arjun Patel, delivered both good and unsettling news. The FDA had granted fast-track status, compressing timelines by months. But an international consortium of privacy watchdogs had requested a hearing. They worried that CRISPR edits to mu opioid receptors could be stacked with future neural compliance chips, creating populations chemically predisposed to obedience. Meridian prepared white papers explaining off-target safeguards, yet she recognized the irony. After years of being erased by firmware trickery, she now had to convince the world that precise genetic control served liberation, not domination. Cassian proposed an unprecedented move. Open source the entire editing protocol under a do no harm license, monitored by the same watchdogs. Board members balked, citing competitive edge. Meridian argued that trust was a currency Wilder Bio could not afford to devalue. The debate stretched past midnight in a mahogany-paneled boardroom, where Dominic Wilder's portrait glared down like a profit-obsessed ghost. When the vote finally tipped in favor of transparency, Meridian exhaled a tremor she hadn't realized she'd been holding, aware that the decision threaded a needle between altruism and corporate survival. Cassian closed the session by announcing that any shareholder seeking purely extractive gains was free to divest. 2 hedge funds did exactly that within 24 hours, and the stock dipped 7% before stabilizing, bruised but honest. Meanwhile, the Valente saga refused to settle quietly into legal archives. Giorgio's sentencing loomed, and tabloids teased every lurid detail of the trial's evidentiary cache. Emails ordering witness eliminations, coded ledgers tied to political bribes, even grainy footage of the patriarch toasting a successful firmware. Sabotage. Meridian tried to shield herself from the sensationalism, but she couldn't ignore the spike in online vitriol. Conspiracy theorists claiming her emergence was a deep state ruse. Trolls morphing her wedding photos into memes that questioned her humanity. One evening she scrolled too long, found a thread proposing that unblurring her face had triggered recent cyber outages, and slammed the laptop shut, pulse hammering with a mix of rage and sadness. Cassian suggested a digital sabbatical weekend in the Catskills. They hiked misty trails, cooked over a campfire, and talked about adopting an elder rescue dog because, Meridian said, loyalty should travel both directions through time. They returned with muddy boots and a 12-year-old shepherd mix named Kismet, who quickly learned to ignore the tower's elevator chimes and who slept curled against Meridian's desk chair whenever she pored over assay results late into the night. The next tremor came from within Wilder Bio's own culture. A junior data scientist, Milo Chen, uncovered anomalous assay curves in a subset of Oklahoma samples. Signals suggesting someone had spiked the control batch with synthetic endorphin analogs. The tampering jeopardized statistical validity and, if leaked, could crater public trust. Meridian convened an emergency task force. Within hours, Elspeth traced the sabotage to a third-party logistics vendor, recently bought by a shell company whose ultimate beneficiary was a still wealthy tier of the Valente clan, seeking vengeance by undermining Meridian's credibility within regulatory circles. Cassian felt the old surge of protectiveness, but Meridian surprised everyone by inviting the Watchdog Consortium to audit the incident in real time, live streaming lab meetings and chain-of-custody reviews. Radical exposure, she argued, was the best inoculation. The strategy worked. Watchdogs issued statements praising Wilder's transparency. Regulators extended deadlines rather than rescinding fast-track status, and social sentiment swung back positive. Cassian saw the lesson. Meridian no longer needed secrecy as armor. Light was sharper. Yet each act of openness extracted a toll. Meridian's nightmares returned. visions of her lab exploding in loops, her face melting into pixel fog, strangers' hands yanking her into black vans. She started sleepwalking, once waking in the conservatory surrounded by overturned citrus pots, frost clinging to her bare feet. Cassian researched trauma specialists accustomed to high-profile whistleblowers and found Dr. Naomi Gruel, a psychiatrist who integrated EMDR with narrative exposure therapy. Meridian resisted at first. Therapy felt like reopening a wound she had just cauterized. But after she snapped at Kismet for barking at a thunderclap, she scheduled sessions. Cassian attended the first, watching Meridian recount the explosion in granular detail. Sounds, smells, the ghost flash of a colleague's eyeglasses flying past. And he realized healing demanded a bravery rivaling any courtroom stand. Over weeks, Meridian's nightmares receded. The sleepwalking stopped. She began teaching Kismet to differentiate thunder from elevator dings, an act both mundane and symbolically profound. Autumn painted the city in burnt oranges when the FDA scheduled its final advisory panel vote. Meridian prepared a brief rooted not only in efficacy, but in the ethical precedent of open-source gene therapy. She addressed the panel in a room humming with medical industrial interests. Pharma giants anxious about profit dilution, patient advocates pleading for access, ethicists wary of unintended cascades. She spoke of an economy where health isn't hoarded, of technology wielded like a scalpel, not a brand. Panelists grilled her on supply chains, post-trial surveillance, and the risk of black market hacks. She answered each with the calm of someone whose identity once evaporated, and learned that uncertainty isn't a void but a canvas. When the vote came, 9-2 in favor, Cassian felt tears he refused to wipe away because visibility, he'd learned, meant letting emotion be recorded even in 4K. Celebrations were brief. Scaling production demanded frantic weeks of bioreactor commissioning and distribution contracts. Cassian delegated operational chaos, choosing instead to craft a compensation framework for families the opioid crisis had already hollowed. Meridian co-designed patient assistance portals, her blurred past now a credential. She knew what it meant to be erased by systems. Kismet roamed the corridors, wearing a service dog vest embroidered with the company's new motto, "Presence is the cure," a line Meridian coined during a press Q&A. Sentencing day arrived in early winter. Snow powdered the courthouse steps, muffling crowds. Inside, Giorgio Valente, pale behind bulletproof glass, stared at Meridian as Judge Hernandez delivered 30 years without parole. Meridian met his gaze once, not with triumph, but with a steady acknowledgement that even monsters exist within the visible spectrum now. Outside, microphones clamored for statements. Meridian spoke softly. Accountability is not vengeance. It is the soil where prevention grows. Cameras zoomed on Cassian's hand, finding hers. Headlines. The next day, split focus between the hefty prison term and the shepherd mix, patiently waiting beside Meridian's ankle. That night, while city snowplows carved neon furrows through slush, Cassian and Meridian retreated to the penthouse conservatory. They sipped mulled wine, sunlight now a memory behind glass, and talked about legacy. Cassian confessed he once believed dynastic impact was measured in patents granted and markets captured. Meridian countered that true legacy might be the number of people who no longer feel invisible, because someone modeled how to step into light. They sealed the conversation with a kiss tasted faintly of cinnamon and relief. and Kismet barked approval, tail thudding like a metronome to new rhythms. Later, as Meridian drifted to sleep, face relaxed, unblurred against pillow, Cassian opened his journal and wrote a single line. Chapter 6 ends here, but Presence writes the chapters that follow, one unfiltered frame at a time. He closed the book, switched off the lamp, and let the city's soft electric glow stand watch, knowing some threats might return in rebranded suits, but so would every lesson. Transparency trumps fear, and love, once rendered visible, refuses to fade. Cassian awoke to Kismet's cold nose nudging his palm and the faint citrus scent that drifted through the penthouse whenever the conservatory misters cycled at dawn. Meridian was already up. He could hear the soft click of her stylus against a tablet somewhere down the hall. And, for one delicious moment, he let himself lie still, cataloging the new quiet that had settled over their lives since Valenti's sentencing. It was not the brittle silence of hypervigilance, but a breathable hush, like the pause between tides when the beach belongs to sandpipers and children building castles. Yet, beneath the calm, ran an undercurrent of work still unfinished. FDA post-marketing commitments, rural clinic rollouts, the whistleblower clinic's first caseload, and a board retreat convening in 48 hours at Wilder's Adirondack Research Lodge to draft a 10-year vision no longer warped by cartel interference or secrecy. Downstairs, he found Meridian in the kitchen wearing flannel pants and one of his old Oxford shirts. Hair coiled at the nape, Kismet's chew rope looped carelessly around her ankle so the dog could tug, while she annotated protein folding diagrams. She looked up, pushing a loose curl with the back of her wrist, and told him she had just discovered a potential off-target edit in the receptor modulator's latest batch. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to warrant pausing shipment to 5 clinics, until assays confirmed neutrality. Cassian felt the sting of delay. Investors were hungry for a triumph unthreatened by caveats. Still, he trusted her instinct more than any analyst's quarterly hunger pang. He brewed 2 mugs of dark roast and called Bishop, ordering an immediate freeze on distribution lots 44B through 44F. Then texted the Oklahoma principal investigator to prepare for slight postponements. Meridian smiled her thanks, the kind that said partnership was measured in reflex alignment, not grand gestures. They spent the morning side by side in the 6th-floor open lab. Meridian spun up CRISPR off-target screens, while Cassian audited supply chain logs, tracing a subtle variation in a Singapore plasmid vendor's temperature records. As hypotheses narrowed, Meridian's eyes lit. She loved the hunt, the exactitude that rooted moral decisions in data rather than fear. By late afternoon, Elspeth confirmed their suspicion. A batch of carrier plasmids had experienced a brief, undocumented temperature spike during customs delay, altering expression efficiency. The fix was simple, an extended quality check protocol. But the willingness to halt rollout would signal to regulators and patients that Wilder's transparency pledge was built into muscle memory. News of the delay leaked, of course. A business reporter, hungry for a bearish angle, wrote that Wilder's wonder drug might dissolve under scrutiny. Shares dipped 3%. Meridian suggested a live Q&A streamed from the manufacturing floor. Cassian countered with an even bolder stroke. Invite the Watchdog Consortium, plus random patient advocate subscribers, to witness the repeat assays in real time. Public relations gasped at the risk of letting unfiltered observers into a GMP facility. Meridian only lifted an eyebrow. Fear of optics had fueled the cartel's entire strategy, had it not? 48 hours later, under bright fluorescent lights and wearing full Tyvek. She pipetted control samples while 5 watchdog delegates and 2 opioid survivor parents observed, microphones catching every technical aside. When the corrected assays landed within tolerance and the parents cheered, the reporter posted an update. Transparency pays. Wilder halts shipment. Fixes flaw. Restarts with watchdog applause. The stock regained its dip before market close. That evening, Cassian and Meridian walked Kismet along the High Line's winter garden, iron rails glistening from an earlier sleet. Neon bled across wet planks, and for once they moved without bodyguards, trusting the city's ordinary bustle instead of armored shadows. They talked about the Adirondack retreat, about how to convince directors that open-source gene editing didn't mean bleeding margin, but breeding resilience. Meridian mused that perhaps Wilder's future wasn't drug discovery alone. Maybe it was a platform for ethical biotech governance. Cassian felt the old adrenaline of strategic visioning, but now grounded by a North Star question. Would this keep people from being erased? They agreed to propose a 2-tier charter. Revenue projects funding a public good endowment seeded with 15% of net profits. Decisions ratified by an external ethics board with veto power. It would scandalize purists of shareholder primacy, but Wilder's identity had already mutated. Refusal to evolve was the real risk. At home, their elevator opened to a surprise tableau. Bishop, Elspeth, and Arjun, standing beside a cake shaped like a double helix. The board retreat had been moved up 24 hours due to director scheduling chaos. They would leave at dawn. Meridian laughed, half delighted, half exasperated, and Bishop confessed he thought cake might soften the blow. They sliced pieces, toasting to glitches caught early. Cassian noted how easily their wartime council had become a chosen family. He saw it in Elspeth passing Kismet contraband frosting, Bishop discreetly swapping Meridian's sparkling water for her favorite peppermint tea soda, Arjun quietly retrieving a stray post-it from Meridian's hair. Community built on shared siege had crystallized into something gentler, but no less vigilant. Before bed, Meridian packed her travel binder, slipping in Polaroids from the Oklahoma clinic, each photo annotated with patient initials and small hopes. J.D. wants to drive truck again. M.S. grandbaby due in March. She said those faces kept the science humane during boardroom sparring. Cassian added a copy of the ethics board proposal, kissed her temple, and murmured that tomorrow they would negotiate not from weakness, but from a surplus of moral clarity. They woke before dawn to sleet hammering against glass. The chartered helicopter lifted over a city curled under gray fleece, then banked north toward mountains frost-hazed blue. Cassian watched Meridian gaze out the window, her reflection sharp in the plexiglass. No hint of blur. He squeezed her hand, and she squeezed back, each aware that chapter titles mattered less than the sentence currently unfolding. Two people carried forward by presence, committed to ensuring no lens, digital or human, could ever again decide who deserved to be seen. Snow began in earnest halfway through the flight to the Adirondacks, fat flakes swirling in the rotor wash before dissolving against the plexiglass like soft sparks. By the time the helicopter banked over Wilder's mountain lodge, a modernist sprawl of glass and blackened timber cantilevered above a frozen lake, the landscape lay hushed beneath an immaculate white sheet. Every pine bough bowed as though in solemn welcome. Cassian felt the subtle pitch of the skids kissing the pad and glanced at Meridian. She offered a tight smile, equal parts anticipation and fatigue. then unclipped her harness while Kismet stretched in the aisle, yawning wide enough to show teeth, still sharp despite age. Inside the lodge, the board had already gathered. Sweaters and smartphones in uneasy coexistence around a stone hearth where a fire cracked patiently. Windows 3 stories high framed the lake, its surface a single slab of slate ice scored by wind-blown lines that looked, to Cassian, eerily like the old blur that once haunted every photo of Meridian. Bishop met them at the threshold, eyes bright behind wire frames. Regulators had formally approved the updated assay protocol overnight, clearing distribution. The news buoyed the room. Even Director Sloan, notorious for counting profitability by quarter, not century, allowed a genuine grin. The retreat's first agenda item was trust architecture. Meridian and Cassian outlined their two-tier vision. Slides bathed in firelight glow. They proposed turning Wilder's dormant praxis mesh outward, an open repository where any lab worldwide could deposit audit trails for gene editing experiments. Hashed to an immutable ledger governed by a council of ethicists, patient advocates, and rival biotech scientists. Sloan worried aloud about ceding intellectual advantage. Meridian responded by projecting a heat map of opioid mortality and asking how many patents could resurrect the dead. Silence settled. Snow thudded against the windows like a muted gavel. Director Alvarez, herself a former virologist who'd lost a niece to fentanyl, broke the lull by moving to approve the plan for a 2-year pilot. The vote passed 10-2. Cassian noted the nays in his ledger, not as enemies, but as markers of work still to do. Evening folded over the lodge. Wind keened through eaves, and chefs laid out communal tables heavy with venison stew, root vegetable gratins, and a single vegan corner for Arjun's strict diet. Conversation drifted from quarterly risk models to the way fresh snow alters acoustics. Elspeth arguing that silence can be mathematically quantified. Meridian excused herself halfway through dessert, returning with a slim archival box. She set it beside the wine decanters and told the room it contained the last hard-copy lab notebooks from the Valente years. Evidence no longer needed for trial and slated for federal archiving. She invited any director who still harbored doubts about her transparency to read them before morning. No one touched the box, but its presence served like a lit candle in a dark corridor, proof that secrecy now had nowhere to hide. After dinner, Cassian and Meridian ventured onto the frozen lake. Kismet bounding ahead, claws skittering on ice. Clouds had shredded, revealing a sky quilted in brutal, dazzling stars. They trudged to the middle, where lodge lights looked like miniature hearths tucked among trees. Meridian removed a small antique camera from her coat. Cassian's Leica, loaded with black and white film. She framed him leaning on a ski pole, beard haloed with frost, then asked him to photograph her. He focused. Her breath fogged the lens. He waited, intentional, until the vapor cleared, then pressed the shutter. The click echoed faintly across the basin. When she lowered the camera, she was crying. Not the tremor of despair, but the release of a muscle that had clamped invisible for too long. Cassian pocketed the Leica and opened his arms. She stepped in, forehead to sternum, murmuring that she could finally picture a future without fearing the photograph. They might have stood there all night, but Kismet barked sharply, ears pivoting toward shoreline. From the trees emerged Sloan, bundled in a parka, crunching across crusted snow. He raised a thermos in greeting and admitted he'd come to walk off too much brandy. He said he had once believed altruism was marketing varnish, but in the afternoon session he'd watched Meridian explain recombinant vectors to a junior legal aid with the same patience she gave panel chairs, and realized culture wasn't. Top-down. Character seeped from moments no one was scoring. He removed a sheet of stationery from his breast pocket. His formal commitment to seed the public good endowment with 10 million of his own shares. Meridian blinked, took the paper, folded it into her glove. Sloane trundled back to shore, footsteps already filling with fresh flakes. Near midnight, the wind died. They crossed the ice, Kismet trotting, until lodge warmth wrapped them. Board members had retired. Only Bishop remained by the fire, annotating budget drafts. He closed his tablet when they entered, eyes gleaming behind fatigue. He reported that Asian markets had reacted favorably to news of Wilder's transparency pilot. Pre-market futures suggested yesterday's dip would reverse. Cassian clapped his shoulder, sent him to bed. He and Meridian lingered, hands thawing near flames, listening to timbers sigh as their resin contracted. Meridian spoke first, voice small in the cavernous quiet. She said she feared the next threat wouldn't be bullets or lawsuits, but veneration. People turning her into symbol instead of scientist. Cassian answered that symbols only flatten depth if the subjects stop telling stories. He promised to ask her, every year at retreat, what chapter of the story she wanted next. She laughed, a short, bright note, and said next year she wanted to arrive by train, not chopper, so she could photograph the transition from city to wild in slow frames. They retired to their suite, where windows overlooked the moonlit lake. Snow had polished it to mirror. Their reflections hovered ghost-like, yet wholly present. Cassian set an alarm for dawn. Regulators awaited a progress webcast at 8 a.m. But Meridian reached to silence the device. For once, she said, let dawn find us before the world does. She lay back, dark hair spreading like ink on the linen, and whispered that visibility was less exhausting when shared. He slid beside her, heart steady, and felt the truth settle. The mob had failed to unmask her, because unmasking was never surrender. It was self-delivery on one's own terms. Outside, clouds gathered for another storm, but inside the room remained hushed. The exile of blur replaced by the intimacy of focus. Snow began again at first light, but Cassian didn't hear it. He woke to Meridian tracing gentle circles on his shoulder, camera at her side, ready to catch the pale sunrise slanting through frosted panes. He realized the board, the market, even the clinics would wait an extra hour, because sometimes the most radical transparency was to pause and let ordinary light record two people in perfect, unedited stillness.